everyone, and welcome back to Security in the 21st Century. I'm Suzanne Loftus, and I'm pleased to have with me on the show today Anna Wieslander. Anna Wieslander is the Director of Northern Europe at the Atlantic Council office in Stockholm. Anna, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm honored.
So Anna works at the Atlantic Council. Could you tell us a little bit more about what projects it's primarily involved with and what exactly your role is at the Atlantic Council in Stockholm?
Well, Suzanne, the Atlantic Council is a non-partisan foreign policy think tank founded in 1961 and with its headquarters in Washington, D.C. And we have a mission to work together to secure the future based on a transatlantic agenda, you can say, but our outreach is global. So we cover all geographic areas around the globe and have a broad agenda from energy to new technology to more traditional defense and security issues. And that's what I work mostly with in Northern Europe, based in Stockholm. That's my background in defense and security. So I do a lot on Baltic Sea security, new threats to Northern Europe, the Arctic, but also connect to the broader transatlantic agenda and to also the newer agenda of the European defense cooperation.
Being a Swedish yourself and based in Sweden, I would love to hear your perspective on why Sweden is not currently a member of NATO and whether there is consensus within Sweden to continue with that policy, or if there is debate about possibly becoming part of the alliance someday. And do you think this would have security benefits for the country?
Well, yes. Sweden is traditionally military non-aligned, neutral. We were that during both World Wars. And that has been our stance. But after the Cold War, we started participating very closely with NATO through the Partnership for Peace and through the international missions that NATO led in both on the Balkans, Afghanistan, and so on. So Sweden and Finland together have developed very close interoperability with NATO. Mm-hmm. And also in these recent years when we've had a more assertive Russia in the Baltic Sea region, we have also cooperated and developed cooperation with NATO in the field of collective defense to some extent, in that we exercise this together. And we also have signed host nation support treaties with NATO, both Sweden and Finland. So in this way, we are very close partners to NATO. But and the public opinion has no problem with that. You might think they would, but it makes sense to a lot of people that we have this more pragmatic approach to cooperating with the alliance, since this is the security situation that we have. And we have a public opinion that is more prone towards NATO membership, but not an absolute majority. So say that it used to be around 25%, 1/4 was traditionally in favor of NATO membership. That is around 40% nowadays, but still not above 50%, not a major shift like that. And the political parties in parliament, several of them have also shifted, so they would want us to apply for NATO membership, but not the government. So the Social Democrats and the Green Party, which have been in power since 2014 during these more difficult years, they are not in favor. And their arguments would be that, being outside of alliances have served Sweden well throughout the years, and to rock the boat kind of behavior and change and make a shift in security policy would destabilize the security situation in the Baltic Sea region, and that would not be in our favor. And Russia has also been very clear on that they would consider this to be a negative thing, and that they would have to take precautions and act. They don't define exactly what they would do, but that it would have consequences for their military posture. But the ones that are in favor of NATO membership, they put more emphasis on the fact that we would need to act with NATO and our allies anyway. We don't have any space of maneuver, so to say, if there would be a conflict in our vicinity because of the security independence in between us. So everyone would be affected by this kind of conflict anyway. And the only difference then from being an ally is that we would not be at the table where the decision making is around in NATO, and we would not be able to do the operational planning either to prepare for conflict. We can share information regarding operational planning, but we can't actually depend on each other for that, those kind of preparations, not from the Swedish side and not from the alliance side. So those are the negative sides, and I would underline that what we have seen, if there would be a conflict that originates from Russia, we would expect it both perhaps to have very rapid developments, and also probably start with some kind of hybrid scenario, which could be difficult to assess what's actually happening, and there would be perhaps various attempts to conceal various developments and so on. So we would need to put our intelligence together and assess the situation together with allies anyway, and that would be a disadvantage for us. But so these are the things. It depends a bit on what you emphasize, the peacetime setting, and when is a good time to change that, and what would happen if there was a kind of conflict or war situation.
Well, there's still, as you highlighted, a lot of cooperation between Sweden and the alliance in any case. Which serves very well for the current climate, the possible challenges that we're likely or that we may face from Russia in the future. There's also been a lot of talk about European strategic autonomy, and even though it's not a new concept, it's still been discussed a lot more recently, and we've heard Merkel and Macron stating that Europe needs to go its own way now, and that it may not always be able to rely on its American allies, and that it's just something that the European continent needs to really prioritize right now. And you wrote about that as well, and I wanted to ask you your opinion. Why do you think the United States is so afraid of European strategic autonomy? And within Europe, are all the states in Europe kind of in line with this concept, or they don't basically believe in this concept as much as some of the others?
Yes, the American response to strategic autonomy or European autonomy and so on, I think throughout the years has been skeptical, and you can say to some extent schizophrenic, actually, because on one hand, since the 1950s, 1960s, there's an eternal discussion, you can say, on burden sharing, and that Europe should take more responsibility for its own defense, and that the US has peaked and should be able to get more relief by increased European engagement in security and defense. So that's the one signal. But on the other hand, when Europeans then make attempts to increase defense cooperation, the Americans become hesitant and often appear a bit, skeptical, or what's in this? Why are you signaling adrift or distancing from the US? Sometimes it's about that the Americans don't see that Europe is putting in the right resources. There are a lot of words to it, but where are the money? Show me the money, in a way. Where are the investments to push through with this autonomy? Because it's costly if you need to fill the gaps, for instance, on strategic airlift or communications, and we don't see that. So why are you talking like this if you don't pull through with what you're doing? That's one American aspect, which I think makes sense. there are defense industrial aspects to it. If you want to have more autonomy when it comes to innovation or defense material, would that mean that there is less room for American procurement, or can we cooperate? So that's one aspect that is discussed a lot. And then I think it's also a bit about American leadership, to be frank, and that's a big discussion point now if we look at the US election and what will come next. Because can the US adapt to a world where you don't go first, perhaps, you don't lead and everyone follows. You can't dictate the rules, as some would say. You would have to discuss more on how to do things with a more concerted European view. Is that even, a way that the US wants to act in the world? So that's also an aspect of it, and the leadership part, because the US has perhaps one kind of leadership. Is that the right kind of leadership for a more equal relation in the world, where Europe is more of a global partner? So these are the aspects across the Atlantic, and I don't think we have calibrated yet. I would like to see more of what is an appropriate level of autonomy, if you talk about European autonomy, and how do we achieve that together. We should have an agreement on how to proceed, and we don't have that. And we don't have an agreement, as you indicated, in Europe either, on the right level of autonomy. So you would have a lot of more transatlantic leaning states that would perhaps prefer, yes, diversification and a certain level, but not a total independence. And then you would have more of a French view, where you would argue along French lines that the world is shifting, US hegemony is ending, Europe must prepare and guard itself and needs to be independent. Within coming decade or so, we'll face a new world, China rising and so on, and we need to prepare for that and start preparing for that now. And then the final aspect of autonomy is that I think as a consequence of COVID-19 and the effects of the pandemic, this has become a much broader discussion within Europe as well. So it started within defense, and basically meaning, the ability to act for ourselves if necessary out of area. Perhaps in Europe's neighborhood, if the US was not interested or couldn't, because the US was busy elsewhere, to lead such a mission or to engage with troops, Europe would have that capability. And that's still the core message of it when it comes to defense. But in addition to that, it has become a much broader discussion on critical supply chains, on industrial autonomy, digital autonomy, and all kinds of issues. And there we are just starting to have a debate. We will see where this leads, but the European Council and President Michel is pushing this very hard, I would say. Other parts of the EU system are not pushing it that hard. But this is up to grabs, so to say. We will see how it will end.
Yeah, there's so many factors to consider. The world is definitely changing. Power dynamics are changing. Relative wealth has shifted to the east. The United States is upping its presence in the Asia Pacific in case something erupts over there. And should something happen over there, the European continent should have the capabilities to defend the European continent, and so there's a lot of avenues for cooperation between the United States and the European Union to strengthen their defense capabilities together. I think the debate is very much about industry. I think there's a lot at play on that particular point. But there's certainly just a lot of avenues for potential that should be explored. And so a European pillar in NATO is a term coined by the Kennedy administration in 1961. But it's an old idea. And you mentioned that it's an old idea whose time has finally come. And the EU and NATO should focus on defending and developing such a pillar. Would you please elaborate on your ideas for this, and specifically, what would Germany's role be?
This European pillar in NATO, it's a bit of an alternative to European interdependence, you can say. So that would be a way for Europe to step up, but still keep a transatlantic framework for that kind of effort. And it's a term that, as you say, it has a long history, and it has been pushed by the UK in the 70s, in the 80s, and now Germany also usually mentions it frequently, but has so far not developed much of context. What would it be? So my idea would be to have Germany, and I think it should be more than the European Union, because that would lead the idea to an EU caucus within NATO. I don't think that's what we want. We want more of a European responsibility platform, actually. So the UK would be central to have along this idea as well. And Germany could serve as the engine, being, both a big power and increasing its military spending now, and also a unifier, you could say, an actor that smaller countries are used to line up with, and usually Germany is good at finding solutions that are accepted by plenty of allies or EU member states. So they could serve and also have a good bridge over to France, of course, but France is a bit more of has its own way and a way of thinking in areas than I would say, the majority of other European states. So there would be a political dimension to a European pillar in NATO, which is more about both aligning views within among the Europeans, and of course the EU is important, but as I said, I don't think Norway or UK should be excluded from that group, and to bridge over to the US in a way that signals that Europe takes more responsibility. So you would have this back and forth and more of a political consultation mechanism at some point, which is kind of unifies European views and makes it easier for the US to work with Europe as a partner. And then on the military side, you would also need, of course, to make adjustments and perhaps take seriously, not least, the bridge between NATO planning process, the gaps that have been identified that would be necessary for Europe to develop in order to be more ready to meet perhaps first a regional conflict from some kind of antagonistic threat. You would have these kind of strategic resources that are needed. They're well defined, but they are, they are not realized. And then you would have also the ability to work in larger formations among the Europeans and so on. So you would have a range of consequences, and you would also then need to link the development within the EU, the European Defence Fund, these new initiatives, the PESCO projects, the CARD process, the planning process within the EU, so that you avoid duplications and unnecessary overlaps and have a smooth process going there. And military mobility is one such project, for instance, that stems from NATO needs and requirements, but when you look at it, a lot of the jurisdiction and the funding are within the EU. So you would need to plan that, bridging both perspectives in order to increase reinforcement capabilities on the European continent. So that's one example where we could work more closely.
Yes, definitely. There's a lot of potential there, but especially with military mobility, as you just mentioned. But the threats these days, it's conventional warfare no longer seems to be the most pressing type of threat or challenge that we're facing. And NATO must evolve to these types of threats. So to decide how would they respond in the event of, say, some high-level propaganda technique that would, for example, influence the ethnic Russian minorities in, say, Estonia to rise up and start something there. And it's not part of Article 5 necessarily. So how do we adapt to these changing threats? And what are the nature of these threats today, these hybrid threats that we hear about so often in the 21st century?
I think you outlined it well, and this is a major shift that we see, and NATO is also spending a lot of efforts in defining this when it looks ahead now in its 2030 process on a new strategic concept. And these kind of hybrid threats that are actually integrated, you can say, almost in our peacetime societies, they pose a very special challenge to our modern societies, because they occur often in also what is connected to peacetime legislation. So we would not have war legislation going, but the nature of it would be perhaps similar to some extent, because it's aggressive and it's from another state, and it aims at weakening institutions, weakening public opinion and stance, and in a way hits at the resilience of nations. And Article 3 is one that in the NATO North Atlantic Treaty, which actually highlights the need for states to work on their self-help, or being the first line of defense. And I think that is an increasing trend, because it is about being prepared to meet, for instance, cyber attacks, or, as you say, disinformation campaigns. And if you don't have the national resilience, you will not have resilience at NATO level either. And we saw this very clearly with the pandemic, which was the health sector, and it was a peacetime threat, but I think no one doubt it was also a threat to our securities of societies. But in the beginning, when you had a situation where the resilience did not work among the allies, you did not either find cooperation at the international level. It was a reaction to turn towards your own and protect yourself and grab for yourself and not share and think of others. And after a while that settled in, but those mechanisms need to be much, much better. And that was a good test case, I think, for what can be done better. Better political consultation processes, better information sharing, and also monitoring of what's going on. That's also an important role for an international institution. But then also perhaps providing cost-sharing mechanisms, so that it becomes a good thing for the government to work within the international institution, because it kind of calibrates national interests and helps making this more efficient. So these kind of coordination cells and all of that. So it's a two-level game where the state has a more prominent role perhaps than the institution. And you have to meet it with peacetime resources. And then you can also, of course, act with mechanisms such as sanctions and those kinds. But there, the alliance is not either perhaps the main mechanism. You would have the EU, and then aligning with states such as the US, Canada, and UK. So the instruments are not traditionally military either to meet these kind of hybrid threats. But that does not make them irrelevant. That's another part of this game. If you don't have that kind of muscle in the far end of the conflict spectrum, you are not able to meet the hybrid threat as efficiently either, because you don't perhaps have the muscles behind a way of assertive action that you would dare to have if you also have a strong defense that you hopefully never need to use. So those things are also interconnected.
Yeah, definitely. You brought up some really, really important points there. So In terms of, say, the European security order now, as we've talked about, we're facing some challenges, some different challenges, the rise of China, the rise of Russia and its more aggressive foreign policy in the last 6 years. And also the rise of authoritarianism. We've seen even in democratic states, they're kind of leaning more towards authoritarian tendencies than they were before. The democratic indicators in the last 10 years have not done so well. And recently, in the last several months, we've seen the protests erupt in Belarus after Lukashenko won the last election again. And this has strong implications for everything that we're discussing here. And I saw that you wrote something very interesting about that. And so, in your opinion, if we frame the situation in Belarus in the context of great power competition, which is one of the main themes of this video podcast series, how is the crisis in Belarus likely to affect the European security order? And how is it likely to affect, say, this democracy versus authoritarian struggle that the world is facing today?
Yes, I think Belarus is a very interesting example in this sense, because when these protests started, I think many people thought, you don't think of Belarus perhaps every day when it comes to European affairs, but the consequences of the developments there have much broader implications for the international setting, and that has to do with Belarus's close relation to Russia. And how developments there unfold will have consequences, as you say, both for the European security order and perhaps even further away than that. And that has to do with being so close to Russia, having historical ties to Russia. You also have to look at how Russia reacts to these kind of protests against fraud when it comes to elections, for instance. And Putin has made clear on several occasions that he does not accept popular uprisings, neither in Russia or in surrounding countries. And he has reacted on that in Ukraine. We have seen it in Georgia. And so in that sense, this is about what kind of system should be allowed, and how do we defend democracy? How do we support those movements as we are defending also the value ground of the West? And if we don't support the democratic movements and kind of marks what we distinguish as right and wrong, what does that say about ourselves and the struggle against other systems? And there again comes, you could see also during the COVID-19 crisis that both Russia and China used the European response and tried to argue that democracies were not as good to respond to the COVID crisis and to take care of the citizens as their systems were. So this is a kind of an ideological struggle also between these systems, the democracy versus autocracies. And military also, Belarus is partly integrated into the Russian military. Strategically, it's part of Russians' thinking along of its western flank and has a defensive depth dimension to it from a Russia point of view. So if Russia would move into Belarus to secure its interests, this would affect the security for the whole European context and for the whole transatlantic context, because we haven't considered that in developing our defense postures towards the Russian threat. So all of this kind of makes the Belarus case something that both great powers need to act on, and the institutions that are kind of the value foundation for democracy and freedom of speech and all of this that we want to defend, and that we see that Lukashenko regime is oppressing, because there has been a wish to keep this as this is a political problem and it should be solved by political measures, and that should be the first line of action, actually, and that is what we have been able to keep so far.
Yes, non-action is just a win for the other side. So, okay, so in terms of, let's say, the transatlantic relationship, which is also one of the major themes of this video podcast series, we've seen that in the last several years, particularly with the new Trump administration in the United States, there's been a bit more of a contentious relationship, not as diplomatic ties have suffered a bit. But it doesn't seem to be the only issue at play. Transatlantic tensions stem from before as well. And so, in your opinion, how would you describe the state of transatlantic relations today? Is it a relationship that would improve with a Biden administration, for example? Or would you say that there are perhaps some deeper structural issues at play? And since you've done a lot of work on the European defense pillar, how would that also play into a new Biden administration, for example?
There are definitely more long-term structural tendencies that play into this, and I think they have been accelerated also in the past years, rather, where we have the rivals rising and the hegemonic moment for the US that was created after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the weakness and the collapse of the Soviet Union. That has passed, and we have a period of transformation where US has to navigate its power. It's still the most powerful state, but it's not the only state. And it's not dominating the way it used to be. And I think also most American politicians recognize that, including the Trump administration, but you just have various ways of navigating it. And you also have various ways of relating to Europe in that sense. So the Trump administration has had no preference of working with Europe, really. I mean, they work a lot with Europe, but define it from a point of view of interests rather than a point of view of a community or a family that firsthand should work together. So that is that's the difference. What we would expect from a Biden administration, the way he expresses himself. He's more of a transatlantist by heart, and would strive probably to create again more of a trustful transatlantic community, because it is fair to say that the relation has been strained in these past years, and there is a US fatigue in Europe, and I think there is an equivalent Europe fatigue in Washington, D.C. to some extent, relating, for instance, to the burden sharing issue, and to perhaps a feeling that the Europeans talk a lot, but what do they actually do, and they're not able to act as they say they could. So both sides are, on one hand, looking at each other with a lack of trust. You hear often in Europe that the US cannot be trusted anymore, and so on. But on the other hand, you also hear a lot that we would like to have a continued transatlantic agenda and partnership ahead, and that we would like to that we are open to redefine both with any new administration and work together to solve global issues more hand in hand. Because Europe and the US still define a lot of the problems that arise around the world in the same way. We have the same approach, we analyze things the same way, and we would perhaps even want the same results. But we don't seem to find ways to hook up and walk, arm in arm and actually solve the problems together anymore. And how can we work with that? That will be a process ahead. China is, of course, a major agenda for that kind of relationship, to solve actually how to deal with China, and there where it should be possible to find more of common ground than we have had so far. And that's a systemic shift that both Europe and the US will have to deal with many years ahead. As we see the rise of China, no one expects it really to stop. It will be a factor ahead, definitely. So I would put that on the top notion, perhaps also affecting the way that we build defense and build responsibility sharing ahead. That could be something to start with.
And it's important to have a common threat perception also. I think that's the major issue, though, when it comes to a common policy towards China between the European Union and the United States. They don't necessarily perceive the threat in the same way, whereas the United States would look at China as an existential threat. Perhaps Europe does not. And might even see it as a kind of an economic opportunity rather. But lately, both sides of the Atlantic at least are coming to terms with the fact that the Chinese may be practicing some unfair business policies in their Belt and Road Initiative, for example, and that it's something to watch out for and to apply stricter policies on. So hopefully in the next several years, there'll be some convergence on how to approach China in that sense. And lastly, the third major theme of this video podcast series has to do with disinformation campaigns. We've been hearing a lot about that, especially during the coronavirus pandemic. How do you think that Russian and Chinese disinformation campaigns affect domestic politics in the European Union and the United States? And based on that, how does that in turn affect the transatlantic relationship?
Yes, that's a big question and a complicated processes to one extent. And I think we know what the aim is of these disinformation campaigns. They aim usually at causing fragmentation and among societies and also within the institutions, to undermine cohesion, and also to sow doubts and perhaps suspicion regarding governments and the way they lead the country. And that way you can also split societies and work with different groups that kind of undermines the resilience of the society and the strength of the society. And that could be everything from rumors regarding homosexuals to adaptation to more serious allegations of how things are run by governments, or election interference, or trying to undermine the confidence that democracies and the elections work the way they should work, and so on. So we have, I think nowadays we know the patterns, and we have alert system for seeing that information campaigns are ongoing, but we need to have perhaps more of a joint way of dealing on how to meet these campaigns. Where lots of countries are working very hard with social media and see how to. And social media has finally, the big companies, Facebook, Twitter, and so on, are working much more consciously with these issues now than they were, because you could clearly see how creating these groupings or bubbles of opinions that they do, and which are underpinned by rumors or disinformation spread by trolls, that creates more extremist views and polarizations within societies. And that is, of course, very dangerous for the democracies. So that is one important thing, to get a kind of democratic governance and a way for the individual to navigate in these digital spheres without being manipulated. That is one key aspect of dealing with it within democracies, to my view. And then how effective it is, I think that's an interesting question, because I think on the other hand, we have seen that an aggressive behavior as such as China's, for instance, where you have allegations of various kinds or accusations towards governments, that tends also to backlash a bit on the opinions on in the public. That is not always seen with, it doesn't fly, so to say. It creates instead awareness of what is this? It's too aggressive, it's too strange, it's too authoritarian, it doesn't fit with our societies. So they also sometimes are not that fine-tuned in the way they are received. We had Sputnik trying to establish itself in Sweden, for instance, the Russian propaganda channel, and they had to close business, so no one was watching, and it didn't work out. No one took it as news. So you also sometimes these attempts are not playing out as they were, as the aims were. They don't get the results they want to because they are not elegant enough, perhaps you could say.
Yeah, but on the other hand, Russia Today has a huge budget, almost the same as that of the BBC, I saw. And they're definitely making a lot of headwind, perhaps because it's less obvious than Sputnik style, but they're definitely having I'd say, a strong effect on the way people perceive the news or perceive events happening around the world. And that in turn creates different opinions and shifts of opinions, and you have multiple groups arguing for multiple truths, and then we no longer know what the truth is anymore, and it's kind of this post-truth world that we've been talking about for several years now. And instead of it being kind of like the Soviet Union and versus US, whose truth is the real truth, now it's not whose truth is real, it's more what is the truth at all, if there is any at all, which is very confusing and risks to be a bit dangerous. So we really need to watch out for that, I would say.
Mm-hmm. I would definitely agree on that, and I think being long term in the way we think about it, it's also very important. Education is really key. Also, being able to be critical towards sources, extremely important. You can also see not only the texts but also pictures, manipulation of footage. One perhaps needs as you've had on money on the bills, a signum that it's an authentic bill, for instance. You might need to have signums for authentic photographs in the future, because you can manipulate all of it, also the voices and so on. So I think we need to continuously work with this. And also what worries me most with this is perhaps that it's ongoing for a very long time. As you say, that there are budgets to it. It's not successful does not mean that they end it. They just work on it on different ways. And the same way as they are, Russia and China are not stopping these efforts, or other groups, we cannot stop building a resilience and defense towards it. So that's only the start, and you have to work with both people and youth in a long-term perspective, and it becomes increasingly important, I would say.
Absolutely agree. Well, Anna, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure for me.
Thank you all for joining in and tuning in again to Security in the 21st Century, and make sure to catch the next episode.